Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for These Are the Voyages, which is episode 22 of season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Paul Z. These Are the Voyages is the episode that takes place in the 24th century on the Enterprise D during the events of the Next Generation episode Pegasus, where we see Riker consults Troy about his crisis of faith that occurred in that episode, and she suggests he visits the holodeck and replay historical events of Captain Archer time period on the Enterprise. There he visits the Enterprise final mission that takes place 10 years after the previous Enterprise episode. Archer is getting ready to make a speech at the announcement of a treaty between several alien races that will eventually become the Federation. When Archer is approached by Shran, who asks for his help in rescuing his daughter from some criminals. The mission was successful and they got Shran's daughter back without a hitch. However, the criminals catch up to Enterprise looking for Shran. There they corner Archer and Trip and threaten to kill Archer, so Trip agrees to take them to Shran, but instead tricks them by causing an explosion. Unfortunately, he dies in this explosion, pretty much sacrificing himself to save Archer. The crew mourns the loss of Trip and then gather to see Archer give his historic speech. Meanwhile, Riker felt inspired by watching these events unfold, so he decides to tell Picard about what he knows about the Pegasus. So, These Are the Voyages is the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise, and generally it is not looked on very kindly. I've seen this episode listed on many people's worst episodes of Enterprise lists, but me personally, I think Enterprise has much worse episodes. I think the majority of season 1 and 2 would be worse than this episode because those seasons had a lot of real bad stinkers. That being said, I didn't think this episode was particularly good, but I think that maybe the reason why so many people love to hate on this episode and single it out is because it's the final episode of the series, and maybe because these people were expecting more. But if you treat it like a normal episode, I'd say it's just your typical below average poor episode. Nothing that terrible that deserves to be put on a worse list. And believe you me, for a show like Enterprise, that is quite a big list. Plus, I don't even think it's the worst final episode Star Trek has ever had. It doesn't even come close to how terrible Voyager's final episode Endgame was, which I would say is in my bottom 5 worst episodes of all of Star Trek. But I won't get into that because I've already talked about that ad nauseum in many other videos. So, first, let me tackle the main complaint about this episode, that it spends the final episode of Enterprise focusing more on the Next Generation characters than the Enterprise crew. Personally, I don't agree with those sentiments, as Riker and Troy clearly are not the main focus of the episode and serve mainly as the narrators who push the story along. It is a bit unorthodox, but there are other examples where we see events unfold for our main characters through someone else's perspective. Be it the episode Distant Origin from Voyager that's told from the perspective of these dinosaur aliens, or the episode Course Oblivion, also from Voyager, which follows a duplicate Voyager crew, or the episode Living Witness, again from Voyager, where we see an alien race's perspective on the Voyager crew that their ancestors encountered over 700 years ago. So these ways of telling story didn't bother me at all. Sure, it may have not been the best pick for the final episode of Enterprise, but I do think it did a good job in connecting Enterprise to the overall Star Trek universe and making it all feel connected. Plus, I think it's a very fitting end that we see just how big of an impact Archer and crew had on the future, and that nearly 20 years later, members of Starfleet still turn to them for guidance. It helped put everything that's happened in the show into perspective, and I really like that. That being said, it was not perfect. The Riker storyline did feel shoehorned in, and it was a bit ridiculous that they tried to claim that this was taking place during the events of the episode Pegasus, because in that episode, Riker and crew were so busy, he wouldn't have time for leisurely chats with Deanna and wouldn't have time to waste on the holodeck. You have to remember, they were right in the middle of a tense mission that could lead to war, and their attitudes and behavior for this episode was just all wrong. Plus, this episode tries to plant the notion that it was the holodeck versions of Archer's crew that convinced Riker to come clean to Picard about the Pegasus, which is total BS. And just the way that they tried so hard to make what happened on Archer's crew in this episode relate to Riker's situation and make him think, oh yeah, maybe you're right, was so forced and fake. I just did not buy it for a second. But the other common complaint about this episode is that it had a 10-year jump, and I will say that was jarring. So this episode takes place 10 years after the previous episode, whereas the rest of the series prior to that took place pretty consecutively. And I have to admit, I agree with this complaint. The reason for them doing it seemed to be so they could jump to the alliance being formed that would become the birth of the Federation, and I would say that is important enough to skip 10 years over if it was handled properly and important to the plot. Was it? Not at all. Almost seemed like a side note where the main plot focused on Shran and his daughter. And that's another thing I want to get into. That is a weak plot. The 10-year jump serves to disconnect us from the plot as well, because we didn't even know Shran had a daughter, or who these criminal dudes were, and what their relationship was to Shran. It's almost as if they're throwing us right in the middle of a storyline that's been going for a really long time. It was very jarring, and it made the whole storyline feel rushed. And the last complaint is the death of Trip. Now, I'll agree, this was very poorly handled. It seemed like he was too quick to sacrifice himself. It seemed like he could have come up with a better plan that didn't involve killing himself. But it's like I said, a major part of the problem was these villains felt fake because we had no background on them. They seemed just like generic cliched villains, and the whole situation where they show up and trap Archer and Trip seemed really contrived. And plus, after Trip died, everyone seemed pretty okay with it. I know they had this one scene with T'Pol and Archer unpacking his things, but even then they didn't seem quite sad enough. And at the conference, everyone's just casually chit-chatting and being friendly. Oh, haha, who cares if my best friend just died? There's free wine here. But then on the other hand, I think I actually like that they killed off Trip, because I cannot stand that character. I was cheering when this guy died. I just cannot stand him. But objectively speaking, it wasn't done very well. So my rating for These Are the Voyages is a 4 poor. So yeah, this episode tried unnecessarily to shoehorn Next Generation characters into this episode. It jumped 10 years into the future without justifying it, and it killed off a major character very poorly, and it seemed to have no impact on anything. But as I said, this episode is by no means the worst of the series. There's some great character interactions. It was great to see how they handled tying Enterprise into the overall Star Trek universe and show what impact the crew had on history and the state of the Federation in the future. So that's it for my review of These Are the Voyages. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review, and I'll endeavor to do so. But please, only 1 episode request per person. And be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek episode reviews and top 10s, and make sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.